All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to start with a story. And this is the story of Jim Ryan and Kip Keino. These guys were big rivals in the 60s in the mile. And this sort of duel led Jim Ryan to break the 4-minute mile as a high schooler. He went on to race Kip Keino in world championship after world championship. And now I'm going to take you into the Olympics of 1968.
They approach the bell. This will be the bell lap. Kip Keino is the leader.
Just playing the bell lap here. Kip Keino is way out in the lead. Jim Ryan is far behind, but Jim Ryan is famous for his kick. So Jim Ryan's going to start moving here with 400 meters left and try to run him down. Kip Keino, by the way, is suffering from a severe bladder infection. He's in tremendous pain. His doctor told him not to run. He's running a high fever, and just before the race, he said, "Screw it, I'm going." He jumped out of bed and ran out onto the track to race this race. So it's a very gritty performance. And while the resolution is not very good, you can't really see, but Kip Keino is just gritting this thing out. And as you can see, Jim Ryan not going to catch him.
It's going to take a monumental effort. He can't do it. Jim, if he does it, it'll be unbelievable. I don't think Jim Ryan can do it. Keino's lead is too much. Kipchoge Keino of Kenya, who ran 10,000 meters last Sunday, ran a 5,000 meter.
This is a watershed moment in the history of sports, because after that, Kenyans start to dominate distance running. As you can see here, 5 high schoolers in the United States have ran a 4-minute mile. 1 high school in Kenya had 4 at the same time. There are 17 U.S. men who have run a marathon in under 2 hours and 10 minutes. There were 32 Kalenjin who did it in October 2011. The Kalenjin are one specific tribe in Kenya. They make up 0.06% of the world population, and yet they dominate distance. It's not Kenyans that dominate distance, it's Kalenjin that dominate distance. And so this raises all sorts of questions about humans and our capacities, and even really difficult questions about race. And so a lot of people try to look into this, like, why is it that the Kalenjin are so good at distance running? And so there's a number of hypotheses that have been floated. One was nutrition. And indeed, they do have a different kind of diet. It's a starchy mountain diet. They live at high altitude in Kenya, so maybe it's their nutrition. But they looked across the world and they found there's other people with very similar nutrition, and they don't dominate distance. And so that had to be thrown out. Maybe it's a piece of it, but it can't be all of it. Maybe it's the environment itself. Maybe it's the high altitude. They're always training at high altitude. So when they come into more oxygen-rich environments, they can just fly. And indeed, that certainly is an advantage, but it can't be the only advantage because lots of Kenyans live at high altitude. So do lots of Peruvians and Bolivians, and they're not dominating distance. So maybe it's the circumstance. They run to school about a 10K both ways. So imagine running 10K twice every day for your entire life, and you're racing your friends, and so it's a competitive 10K. So maybe that's part of it, and indeed it might be. But again, lots of Kenyans are doing this, not just the Kalenjin. So then maybe it's socioeconomic incentives. If you are a star distance runner in Kenya, you can make $20,000 a year. That doesn't sound like much to us, but this is in a world in which most people are making $2 a day. So this is a huge boon, and you're a star, you're a celebrity. So maybe there's some incentives there for that. But again, you have to recognize that all of the Kenyans have this, not just the Kalenjin. So finally, there's the biological question. And here we're not talking about sort of crude racial categorizations, but instead looking at their specific body type. They have what's called a nilotic body type. And you can see their very thin extremities. And this makes their extremities very light and therefore very easy to move in a running type of motion. And if you look at Jim Ryan, for example, Jim Ryan has what you might call a nilotic body type as well. He has very thin arms, very thin legs, especially thin ankles, which is very important for running distance. And those are very important characteristics. But again, there are lots of people with a nilotic body type, and they're still not dominating distance running. So maybe there's something else. Maybe there's something cultural. So looking more deeply into the cultural situation, what we find is that the Kalenjin practice this really intense rite of initiation. So as a man, as a young boy, you're preparing your entire life to become a man, and the threshold you cross to become a man is this initiation in which they cover your body with mud. It dries into this sort of caked on mud on you now, and then they circumcise you. And if you flinch, the mud will crack, and you are not a man. You have to be able to sit there completely still while they circumcise you and show that you're a man. And so the Kalenjin constantly sort of test themselves throughout their childhood to see how tough they are, see how much pain they can take. And it's this kind of, there's two results of this. This also is true for women as well. So women, and this is obviously a very, this is a controversial thing that they do. They also circumcise women, and women also have to show their strength by not flinching when, and this is very intense. They cut off the clitoris. So you can imagine like how intense that would be. So what happens then is that the whole culture is designed around this toughness. And this has a cultural and potentially a biological component. Because if you are not a man, you can't marry. If you're not a woman, you can't marry. And if you show your toughness and you get married, you have children. So the cultural component becomes a biological component. If there's any genetic propensity to toughness, it will get passed on. So these people are just incredibly tough. And that toughness is essential for the way of life that they've had for some time. They are herders, they're nomadic, and so traditionally they would run into frequent wars, and they would have to be tough for those wars. And so the culture really prepares them for all of that. And that's kind of the dark beauty of an initiation ritual, is that it gets you ready for life. In our culture, we have to get ready for this, right? It's like a big mess of like, and you don't know who you're going to be or what you're going to do or how you're going to make it, and you have to deal with all these immense problems in the world and complexity of the world, and you have to figure all of that out. And the best initiation ritual we have apparently is this, and we're not sure if this is enough, but this is what we have. And so what I want to suggest to you guys is that while this class does not teach a specific skill that you're going to use in your life, I do want to suggest that it's maybe a big part of that initiation process that gets you ready for life and all the things of life that really matter. And so the purpose of this class is to give you what's called the anthropological perspective, right? And we've talked about that as seeing big, seeing small, seeing it all. And I want to start off today's class by practicing that, by actually like putting you in a position where you can just see if you can do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to call a moratorium on that taboo against staring. And I'm going to allow you guys to just stare at each other. And we're going to see if you can stare at each other and call forth this capacity to see big, see small, see it all, see your own seeing, see past your judgments. And the beauty of the anthropological perspective, the promise of it, is that you can look around a room like this and see kind of the flow of humanity. You can see all of human history that led to this moment. You can see the future of where all these people are going to go. And you're left with compassion. Like that's the promise of the anthropological perspective. So let's see if we can do this. We're going to call a moratorium on staring. People in the front can turn around and stare at other people and just look around the room and just look at the sort of majesty of all of us together, right? All right, so moratorium on the taboo against staring. Go ahead and start staring at other people. And now start working your way toward a sacred moment where we're all going to be quiet. Like get past the giggles and think about like, why are you giggling? Like, why is this hard? It is hard. It's really hard. Sacred music for the sacred moment. And now do whatever you need to do to get into that sort of sacred space where you really see the humans in front of you, past your own judgments. And this is where you can actually practice some of those anthropological things. So you might try seeing small. Start noticing little things about people. Notice the way they wear their glasses, if they're wearing glasses. Notice the way they, tilt their hat in a certain way, how they wear their hair. What you're looking at is every one of us has been working on ourselves for at least 17 or 18 years, if not more, all crafting ourselves, becoming the people that we are. And every little decision is in some way imprinted on us and makes us who we are. And now let's move to seeing big and think about how, in a way, seeing big allows us to see how small we all are. So think of all the things that had to happen for each one of us to be in this room today. There's all the things in our own lives. And maybe you can even, like, in your mind, you can sort of rewind back a year, and then 2 years, 3 years. What led people to come to K-State? What led them to be in this class? And now go back 5 or 6 years, and what things led the people in here to be the type of people who come to a college like this? Rewind 10, 12 years, 15 years, 17 years. There's some magical moment back there when we're all conceived. Like, imagine that, seriously, like, that's amazing. And you rewind back a little bit farther. Your parents are meeting. You go back a little farther, and now we're going to start seeing really big. There's all the stuff that made K-State what it is. You rewind back a little bit farther, and you have to think about what even created the need for universities, and how did universities emerge? Where back in the 1850s, K-State doesn't even exist. This is just a hillside in the countryside, outside a little settlement on the river. And you rewind just 50 years more than that, and Native Americans are here chasing buffalo. Rewind a little bit farther, and you just keep stepping back. And think of all the things that had to happen for all these people who are in this room today to be here today. And you can even go all the way back if you want. Go back as far as you want. Thousands of years. And now run that back, fast forward, come to the moment, and here we are. And now let's go back to sort of seeing it all unfold again. So the people you're looking at right now, there's 450 people in the room. Statistically, that means that actually several of you think you found the love of your life sometime in the last 3 weeks. There are at least probably 4 people in the room who think they found the love of their life. There are about 4 other people who know they're with somebody who thinks they're the love of their life, and they're trying to figure out how to tell them no. And that's just part of the drama of where you're at right now in your life. There's also a handful of people who have suffered tragedies that you can't imagine in the last year. Just statistically, there are at least 3 people in this room who have suffered immense tragedies in the last year. 4 of you are going to die in the next 10 years. 10 of you will die in the next 20 years. So just like if you want to imagine those people disappearing, and that'll give you some of that compassion that you need. Just be grateful for the ones who are left. So if you get to the point where you can sort of see the humanity in the people around you, then go ahead and turn this way. We're going to do another thing with this. So now hold in your mind what 450 people look like. And now we're going to think about this world, this room, as if it were the whole world. This is another piece of anthropology, right? To sort of imagine the whole world and our role within it. So imagine this room as the whole world. There's 450 people in the world. So take all 7 billion people, and we're going to statistically compress 7 billion down to 450. And this room is going to perfectly represent the world. And so what we'd have in this room is, if we perfectly represented the world, we'd actually have about 200 and just over 225 from Asia. So this room would not be nearly as white as it is. It would be largely Asian. There would be 100 people just from China alone, 80 from India, there'd be 65 from Africa, and there'd just be about 20 people from the United States. 6 people in this room would be dying. if we took like just across like all ages, 6 people in here would be dying. 10 people in here would be pregnant. One of the people who's pregnant would be perhaps in the United States. Another is in sub-Saharan Africa. The baby in the United States will have 10 times the chance of surviving birth. 3,000 years ago, if we just back up in time, there's only 3 people in the room. That's how, there's not many people in the world 3,000 years ago. If we represented in this room, it'd just be 3 people. 2,000 years ago, it grew to 14. 1,000 years ago, 25. 100 years ago, 150. And then in the last 100 years, population has boomed to over 400 that we see here today. Religiously, 140 people in here would be Christian. 120 would be Muslim. 80 would be Hindus. 30 Buddhist. 50 would practice various indigenous religions. And 50 would be non-religious. We have collectively, our collective wealth, you might say, we have 135 sheep and goats, 103 cows, 70 pigs, 15 camels, 9 horses, and 745 chickens. There's actually more chickens in the world than there are human beings. And there's actually plenty of food to go around. And yet, in this room, that room that you just looked at, there are 5 people starving to death, on the brink of death. And there are 49 who are chronically undernourished. Like a whole section of the room is chronically undernourished and often go to sleep hungry. 42 people don't have safe water to drink. 140 people don't have proper toilets or sanitation. Together, each household makes about $10,000 per year, but the richest 80 people in the room live in the wealthy countries and on average make more than $30,000 a year and use up 86% of the world's resources. And just to put this in perspective, if you put your clothes in a closet, store your food in a refrigerator, and sleep on a bed, you're one of the rich people in the world. There are 212 people living on less than $2.50 a day, and the poorest 80 have less than $1.50 a day. The richest person in the room has about 25% of the world's wealth, and more than all the wealth held by the poorest 50%. The income disparity is growing, so the top 80, in the past 35 years, your income has more than doubled, from 12,000 to over 30,000. The bottom 80, you've also increased your income, but only from about 87 cents to 93 cents a day. Collectively, as a society, as a global society, we're going to spend $1,600 billion trying to kill each other or protect each other from ourselves. And for less than 10% of that amount, we could solve world hunger and provide safe drinking water to all. So before I started teaching this class, every year I sit down and I think about like, what are the really big questions that matter? And I think about like these statistics and like think about this world and just think about what it would look like if this were a perfect representation of the world. And what are we going to do about those 50 people who are starving? What are we going to do about the 50 people who can't find safe water? What are we going to do about the people suffering from malaria and so on? And why can't we solve these problems? How does the world work? Why are there so many inequalities? Why do we let people suffer? As I've gotten older, I've had this realization. I think when I was young, I was like, I came into this world, and this world is a bit of a mess, and I'd like to serve it in some way. I'd like to help in some way. As I've gotten older, I've become more and more cognizant of a brutal fact that all the suffering in the world is created by us. Like there is nothing else other than us creating what's happening. And maybe, we see ourselves as individuals as part of the solution and not part of the problem. But the reality is, collectively, us, we make the suffering. So how can we address that? This is the real question about our lives and like, where do we put ourselves in this world? Like, which of the 450 people in the room are we? And what is our role going to be in this world? There's this journey that you have to go on to find these answers. And there's this very well mapped. There's been studies of this. And what we find is that students coming to college tend to see the world in black and white. And it's all about finding the answers. It's just about finding the answers. And then you get to college and professors pose questions. And our immediate response, and I remember this response myself, feeling like, don't pose questions, just tell me the answers. I've got an exam coming up. I need to know what I need to know for the exam. But eventually, you will come to realize, if you haven't already, that there are real controversies in the world, that it's not exactly clear how the world works. People argue about these things, and the controversies are real. There are real debates about how we should solve world hunger or address the water problem or any other big issues that you have in the world. There are real controversies. And in fact, as you immerse yourself in the process of whatever it is you're going to be and whatever it is you're going to do, you'll eventually discover that there are also real ambiguities in the world. The controversies are not necessarily even resolvable very easily. This is also true in your life. So a lot of you will encounter ambiguity in your life before you encounter it in school. You'll have relationships where it's not clear what the right thing to do is. You'll have relationships where you won't be certain at a very deep level if you're in the right or in the wrong. You'll make mistakes and you'll wonder how to get out of them, and you'll find ambiguous circumstance all around you. And the tricky thing about this moment is that if you embrace the ambiguity, you emerge into a new kind of state. And this is where I think that anthropological perspective sits. It's this state of wonder, where you actually embrace the ambiguities of life. You recognize that, yes, there are ambiguities, and you vigorously embrace them and still seek answers and still seek to do your best in whatever way you can. The alternative is something else, and this is what most people do, is they hit ambiguity and they immediately rush back to that safe world of the black and white, where they have the same answers that they came to school with. They see the world the same way that they did when they came in. And somehow we have to find the courage to embrace ambiguity, to embrace the reality of life, to embrace this mess of things, to immerse ourselves into this world of wonder. There is scientifically studied a difference here between the type of learning and the type of expertise that emerges out of these two modes. Those who seek answers are doing what's called strategic learning. These are people who, some of them are actually very good at getting A's. They're very good at getting an A on the exam, very good at getting a high GPA. But in their quest for getting their grades, they end up with what's called a routine expertise. That is, they're very good at problems that have already been settled, problems that have clear answers, things like that. And there's value in the world for people who have routine expertise. But those people are also destined for trouble in the ambiguities of real life. And so the other type of learning is called deep learning. Deep learning is when you embrace the ambiguity and you're taking what you learn and you're constantly applying it to real life in all of its messiness. That deep learning is actually becoming a part of you. It's not just memorizing stuff. It's actually practicing what you're learning and making it something meaningful in your life. And when that happens, you get what's called adaptive expertise. Because the learning becomes a part of you, you face a new problem and you're able to actually apply what you've learned in some new context. You can take on new problems in new ways. So when I first started teaching, I was really interested in this idea that it's not about answers, that ultimately what I want to do is open my students up to new questions. And it was like my first semester teaching, and I started paying attention to the questions my students were asking. And I was hoping that they were asking really big questions like, how are we going to solve world hunger? How are we going to deal with the water problem? But and other big problems as well, like what is true love? What is truth? Like these are great, wonderful, big problems. But most of my students were asking questions like, how many points is this worth? How long does this paper need to be? What do we need to know for the test? And these are not really great questions. So I went on a quest to get to know my students better, and I started having lunches with students. And so for several years, I would have open lunch, and students could come and we'd have lunch. And the rule of open lunch was no small talk. We'd just talk, absolutely no small talk, just jump right into the big stuff. And it was there that I discovered that my students actually did have big questions. And they're the big questions we talked about, like who am I? What am I going to do? Am I going to make it? Just to give you a sense of what these stories would be like one young girl came in to me. She was 18 at the time, just a freshman. She came in and she said, when I was 8 years old, I was sitting in the back seat of my car, and my mom was doing flashcards with me and my little brother. and my little brother was beating me on all these math flashcards. And she remembers this voice come into her head at that point that says, "You're not smart." And she just kept that with her throughout all of high school. And she just decided, I'm not going to be smart. I'm just going to be the pretty girl, and I'm going to be the pretty dumb girl and just be like happy and pretty. And she comes to college and she wants to reinvent herself. And she says, "Dr. Wesh, I've been faking it so long, I don't even know who I am anymore." She's trying to figure out who she is. Another student I met also just come into at K-State, and she told me how she had actually had a really rough go in high school. When she was younger, her parents broke up. Throughout middle school, her mom started getting into drugs and would party a lot and go out at night. In high school, her mom was still partying, going out at night, and one day, her sophomore year, her mom just stopped coming home, didn't come home at all. And she was living in this little tiny house, very poor, and the bills started coming in. She was too ashamed to tell anybody at school that her mom wasn't coming home. She couldn't pay the bills. She got a foreclosure notice. And so she goes to school one day and she is acting out in school like she always did. And the teacher took her out in the hall and starts yelling at her, and she just started crying. And she says, "I don't want to go on." And her teacher listened to her story then and took her home, and she lived with that teacher ever since. She graduated valedictorian, and then she was sitting in my class as an accounting major. And she was an accounting major even though she hates accounting. She was an accounting major just because it was safe. She was never going to be homeless. She was never going to have to face that foreclosure notice again. But she was sitting there wondering if she could really make it. Like, could she pretend to be an accountant? Could she love accounting? Could she even try to be an accountant for the rest of her life? So she's wondering what she's going to do. I've had other students come to me and talk about dropping out of school, struggling to figure out like if it's worth it. And I've seen people drop out of school. I've had students come to me who are just like the best students you think in the world, right? They're just amazing. They do amazing work. And one student actually handed me a note card at the end of class. You guys do these note cards. Well, she wrote two of them. One was for me and one for the TA. The one for me just said, "I know you think I'm doing all this amazing stuff, but I need you to know that I'm running from a household of suicide, anxiety, and depression. And the harder," sorry, why am I apologizing? And she says, "And the harder I push, the more I feel like I'm sort of trapping myself into that same dynamic of suicide, anxiety, and depression." So even like the great students don't necessarily have it all figured out. And so then I was like, as I was studying them, I was struck that as you look around at the media all around us, and it looks like there's all sorts of easy answers. Like Coke just tells you to open Coke and open happiness, or go to Starbucks and find community, or just buy stuff and it makes you feel better, or allows you to show people who you are. But the answers that those give are not only dangerous, there's actually more dangerous answers out there as well. And these are the answers that come to us from the culture around us if you don't question the culture around you. So for example, girls are constantly told that they're not as good at math as boys are. And I don't know if you know this, but if you look at scores, like on the GRE or SAT, it sort of plays itself out that boys do better than girls. So what they did over at Stanford is they had this test, and it was the GRE, which is like the SAT to go into grad school, very hard math exam. And they gave this math exam to a room full of students just like you guys. Before they handed out the exam, they explained that they said, you probably know that these things are biased and that men tend to do better than women on these exams. And so then they handed these out and they said, but we want you to know that we've taken away the bias in this exam. And they took the exam, and the men and women scored the same. The trick was they had not changed the exam. All they did was they told people they'd changed the exam. And this is evidence of what's called stereotype threat, that society has certain images of who you're supposed to be, and you take those on, and then you actually play those out to some extent. And when you're in a math exam, if you have that little voice in your head that says, "I'm not a math person," then you're struggling through a math problem for, say, 10, 15 seconds, and then you say, "Dang, I wish I was a math person," or "I'm just not a math person," and you move on to the next one, and you don't get it right. But if you'd hang with it just a few more seconds, maybe 10 more seconds, you would get it right. If you thought you were a math person, you would struggle through it. Just, darn it, I'm a math person. This problem's not going to get me down. And you make your way through it. And that's the difference. It also plays out in race as well. So there was a study of mini golf that they did. This is by Jay Stone out in Arizona. He set up a mini golf course. And on the first day, he said, he had people come and he said, this is a specially designed course that's meant to measure your ability to see angles and do geometry in your head. Has nothing to do with your athletic ability. And white students outperform black students. And then the next day, he had the same exact course. And he said, this course is specially designed to measure your raw athletic ability. Has nothing to do with your ability to think. And black students outperform white students. So this is evidence of the stereotypes and how they actually affect how we think. And the only way out of that is through some kind of anthropological perspective where you see the messages that society is bringing you and you say no. You don't let those come in. So there are certain learning outcomes really worth pursuing, you might say, and that's what we're working on in this class and what you'll be talking about this week in your recitation. And those outcomes are things like asking questions, like questioning your culture, questioning the stereotypes that are coming at you, questioning the judgments that are coming at you, questioning your taken for granted reality. The second one is opening up to other people and other ideas. Those things help you ask new questions. And the third one is you have to conquer your doubt and your fear. And these three things are related. And if you haven't already listened to the podcast that you're assigned for this week that you'll talk about in recitation, that's really the essence of the podcast. It's about finding ways to conquer doubt and fear so that you can open up and then ask new questions and see things in a new way. So that's why we have this mindset, which we've already talked about, asking questions, making connections, taking chances, why we pursue the goal of experiencing more, experiencing difference, and experiencing difference differently, and why we have this method of seeing our seeing small, and seeing big. And we've already talked about seeing. This is like, we talked about ethnocentrism and how we have to get past our cultural beliefs and practices as the only proper ones. It's a prison for the mind. We talk about cultural relativism, our capacity to suspend judgment, understand others in their terms, look back on our own culture. We've talked about the toolkit, communication, empathy, and thoughtfulness. And we talked about seeing small, like participant observation, where you dive into the culture and you actually act with the culture, you dance with them, and by dancing with them, you see the little things. This is the importance of dancing along. And we talked also about seeing big, this holistic perspective. I want to tell you a story about my own life. It's actually fairly recent, where I realized that I had not been really following my own advice, I suppose. And that has to do with my adventure into drawing. So when I was, there's an interesting thing about grades. You might already have experienced this. Like, grades seem to segment us into different types of people. There's the A student and there's the B student. And the A students are very complacent and very happy with their nice grade, and they do this calculation at the end of class. Like, with about a week or two left in school, most A students will calculate just how hard they have to try on their final exams, and they won't try very hard on the things where they've already got like a 99% and so on. And that's not real learning. That's not deep learning. That's strategic learning, right? And we all are guilty of that to some extent. The Bs might look at the As and kind of wish they were an A student, but they're maybe a little bit okay with that. The Ds and the Fs feel really outcasted, and like that maybe school isn't for them, and they have all sorts of questions about their capacities, and it's really hard to be in that place. So what happened to me with drawing is I took drawing at Kansas State because I loved to draw, and I'd always loved to draw, and it wrecked my GPA. I just couldn't draw the way that they wanted me to draw, and as you can see, maybe they're right. I don't know, but I decided to keep drawing. And in the meantime, I was also talking to students. Not just students. This is the time when I was taking my lunches with students, but also I was talking to alumni, and I was trying to find out like what mattered out of your school, like what really struck you in school. So there I was drawing, and I was determined to look past like my bad grades in drawing to like just. And the thing is, I hadn't drawn in 20 years because of the bad grades. So I started drawing, and then I started animating as well. And I talked to this one student, this former student, and he graduated like 10 years ago, And he was an amazing student when he was here. He got great grades, always came prepared, had certainly done all the readings, but he always felt like life was passing him by in some way, and like he was just missing something. So he came into my class, and one of the things we'll talk about later is this hero's adventure, that all over the world we see these stories about a call to adventure, a road of trials. The hero is then transformed in some way. And there was one girl in the class who really had been transformed and really was a hero. And he met her, and it was like the color was brought into his life. They fell in love, and they raised a kid together, and I thought it was just going to be happily ever after, until he wrote me a few years later. So he says after that, he just started running. He would run like all day, all night. He would run up to 20 miles a day, just trying to figure things out. He ran month after month through all seasons. For almost 2 years, he just ran and ran, often barefoot, just to feel the earth. And then one day, he says it was just like he was lifted outside of his body, and he was running through the park, and he could see himself running through the park from above. And he thought, you know, there's a guy going through the trials of life. And he had this immense compassion for himself for the first time, like he loved himself for the first time. And he looked down on himself and he said, my goodness, you're a hero. But it wasn't that he was like a hero and he was better than everybody else. He actually felt like everybody around him was a hero, that everybody was going through certain trials of life. And it was this kind of wisdom and compassion for others that allowed him to see the problems and ultimately heal his relationship. And that's what he said was kind of the point of a class like this. He said it helped him sort of see it all, to see, not just to see big and see small, but ultimately to see it all. And the gift of this kind of perspective can strike you anywhere. This is what wonder looks like. This is in Wellington, New Zealand, where it never snows. And then you can see here, one day in 2011, it did. And you'll notice that people are not like running into the stores or putting on their jackets. They're just embracing it. In fact, they're running out of the stores. Imagine if that's how you embraced the ambiguities of life. What looks like trouble could seem like excitement. And you could embrace one another, knowing that everybody around you is going through the same chaos, that we're all struggling through difficult things. And there's a certain wonder in that even a simple walk can then seem enchanted. So there's this piece about wonder that like you don't just in wonder, but you're also wondering about things. You're starting to see not only bigger world, but you're also starting to see small. You're starting to see the tiny little things and how every little thing matters. And in that way, you are like a child again. So here we are back in the class, and I want to tell you another story about a student who was in this class who slept all the time, or he looked at me like this. And this is quite the experience. I don't know, I mean, even now, you know, even today, like I've seen people like in their headphones, and like it's hard, like as a teacher, to look out. And I'm grateful to 400 of you who are like attentive and looking at me like you care about this. And it's really hard, though, to see like the handful of people with their headphones on or, tuning out, sleeping, that kind of thing. But so it's hard to look out and see David like this. So this is David, and I swear he took every class I ever taught, and he was always sleeping or looking at me like this. And so I made a little animation about him. So this is what the world looks like from my perspective. I look out at these faces, and I'm very attentive to like how people are responding, and when they're sleeping, it's me. And so this is me in front of the room, and I've got my fancy laser pointer here, and 2 million points of light to dazzle you, but it doesn't always work. As you can see, I have 4 screens in here, and as you know, I will get on tables. It's just really depressing when you do all of that and people are still sleeping. So this is basically how I feel when that happens. So what happened with David is after many years of this, I got really mad, and I was like, I'm gonna do something about this. And so I woke him up in the middle of class, and he said, hey, you wanna go to lunch? So we went to lunch, and I asked him why he slept in my classes, and he said that he was addicted to games. But it was more than that. He not only was addicted to playing them, he also made them. And he started describing this game that he made on hexagon cards that use these mythological figures. And I started to realize he actually knew more about mythology than I did, and I teach a class on mythology. So I started to see him a little differently. And I started to notice that school itself had taught him a different way of seeing himself, that he had been labeled in a certain way, and that it was kind of depressing. So I invited him to be part of a different kind of class, where we would have no lectures, and no textbooks, and no grades. A class where he could use his skills and combine them with the skills of others, some of them just being discovered, to do something really worthwhile. It would be a chance to redefine himself, not as the D student, but as a game developer. So he started developing a game, and he worked all day and night on this thing for months. And I started to see him and other sleepers a little differently. And this is what we did, is I knew that I couldn't take students and take them to New Guinea like I really wanted to. So instead, I took them up the hill to Meadowlark Hills, which is a retirement community, average age about 85. And they gave us a couple rooms, and the students actually moved in, and they lived with the residents up there for the whole semester. And people, all these students, including David, got to know the residents and hear their stories, and then ultimately tried to tell their stories in an interesting way.
I was born November the...
So this is one of the examples here. This is a couple students who interviewed maybe about 30 different residents up there, and then combined their stories into one life story.
I was born November the 12th, 1931.
No, I was born in 1934.
I was born in 1923.
I was born in 24.
Mother had all us children at home. Doctor came out and delivered us.
We were all born at home, no hospital.
I was born and raised on a farm.
Middle of the road, dryland farm. Dad always kept it up.
That was a very innocent time of my life.
So you can see they actually went out and found some of the places where they grew up, schools that they went to, and they're just like acting out this life course that they're talking about, getting married, going to war, coming home, starting a family, and then, going to work and retiring together. And then eventually one of them gets sick or has a fall, and they end up in the retirement community together.
When you're a caregiver for a long time, it runs you down.
He went to sleep that night and never did wake up.
And he died the last part of January. He just died in his sleep, basically. He just looked like he always did. But you can't get him back.
That was hard, because I really, really missed him.
Boy, I missed him. It just hit me that way. He wasn't here. To live in this world,
you must be able to do 3 things.
To love what is mortal.
To hold it against your bones.
knowing that your own life depends on it.
And when the time comes,
to let it go.
let it go.
And by the way, Kinsey, who helped make that video went to a film festival in France, and those students got to go show it in France. Kinsey is the 8-year-old in the backseat of that car and totally transformed herself. She's now in one of the most prestigious graduate schools in the country, or in the world, in the UK. This is Kay, and partying with us. This is her down in Aggieville. And Kay likes to cut loose with the students because she spends the rest of her time caring for a man in late-stage Alzheimer's, the love of her life, who she's already had to say goodbye to because he's already lost enough memory that he no longer can really be himself. And so that's what we did. That's what David actually worked on, was a story with Kay, in which Kay writes these marching orders for her husband, and he has to follow those marching orders every day. And she worried that she might die first. And what would she do if she had to take care of him, but she wasn't there? And what would happen if he woke up one day and she wasn't there? And so we decided to make a virtual reality game about what it's like to live with Alzheimer's when you've lost somebody. And so that's what I'm going to play you guys out with. You're welcome to leave as soon as you're done with your note card. The note card is, how do you think the anthropological perspective can help you in your life? And as you're doing that, I'll play this, and I'll see you guys next week.
Dear Floyd, this is the last thing I will write for you.
We had our secluded spot. It was a tree by the creek. There was a notch in it where she'd leave me little haikus and quirky poems.
You forgot to pay the bills again. That's why we lost the farm.
That was the hardest part. She loved those horses. I had let her down.
Sorry for being a bitch to you when you started struggling with the memory loss. I'm leaving a box of memories so you can sometimes recapture the joy that they brought to us. Floyd, know that I am so full of love and gratitude for the memories of falling through life together with you. Our 60 years together have done nothing but prove beyond doubt that asking you to marry me all those years ago under that tree was the greatest decision I have ever been smart enough to make.
This is the helmet I wore during World War II.
Every time you make someone laugh, I'll be laughing too. Every time you forget something, forgive yourself for me. Life is an ocean, love is a boat. In troubled water, it keeps us afloat. Keep sailing. Love, Della.